So Zach's Tech Turf, a PC gaming channel with almost 2 million followers, made a super viral video discussing the recent blind test comparing native rendering with FSR 4 and the latest DLSS model. This guy nonchalantly says, can gamers really tell a difference between native and upscaling? Well, because in his words this proper test favored DLSS, he ends the video saying, well, that kinda ends the debate. As an organized effort trying to wake up the masses to the image quality crisis in modern gaming, I find that his viral conclusion requires a pro-consumer follow-up that will hopefully train your brain to catch false narratives. If you use critical thinking and the data shown on this channel, anyone can predict the results as I did before making this video. So you take the industry's TAA, which started off as something conservative, meaning it only used 1 or 2 frames, so it wouldn't distort or smear the visuals. It's poor looking by today's standards because pixel rejection logic and things like motion vectors had not progressed enough. The industry was quickly moving towards fixing these issues until a graphics programmer named Brian Karras took his Epic Games pedestal to tell the entire industry, forget making TAA look better, let's make TAA worse by smearing an infinite amount of past frames to pretend we're optimizing unrelated graphic features. So as TAA decreased in quality, so did your basic features like SSR, ambient occlusion, and really an entire documentary's worth of graphics. So DLSS development starts in the middle of this mess. And because the masses were starstruck by the concept of AI gaming, it became their biggest selling point, which forced them to actually research ways to increase its visual quality. Nvidia for a long time didn't have any competition. FSR 1 through 3 were more like industry TAA because it lacked dedicated vendor-exclusive hardware. Ask yourself this question: why are people so marveled when a technique like DLSS looks better when it has dedicated hardware to get its results? If it's using dedicated hardware, the results should look perfect, but it's never been perfect, which is why Nvidia keeps forcing their customers to allocate more and more computations to the DLSS pass. Why are people so marveled by techniques that just use more and more GPU computations with each update to look better? Now that AMD has almost perfectly cloned Nvidia, there's no logical reason as to why FSR 4 wouldn't be ahead of industry TAA. But there's a very logical reason as to why AMD will never catch up to Nvidia. Neither AMD or Intel, if we include XeSS in this discussion, cannot magically clone Nvidia's several-year head start in research and development. So why do these companies even try? Because they know channels like Hardware Unboxed, Gamers Nexus, Digital Foundry, and all these other mainstream voices are going to be good little marketing slaves that are going to dramatize a non-existent race like some kind of infinite NASCAR event. XeSS looks like it's catching up. AMD's just behind Nvidia. Can they get ahead, everyone? No. If everyone used common sense, we'd be able to predict their trajectory. These dramatized races are detracting from the true consumer-based reality, which is horrendous. I am specifically advising that you view the industry through a lens that excludes vendor-dependent aspects, because it's anti-consumer. Take the Phantom Pain for example. That game is a visual treat, but it's shipped with a very poor screen space ambient occlusion, and you can't use Reshade to use different SSAO because of anti-cheat restrictions. Because it's an NVIDIA-sponsored game, it's programmed to allow NVIDIA's driver-based HBAO override, a vastly better ambient occlusion than the game's original option. It's very obvious how this hurts the non-NVIDIA side of consumers who play the game, because they don't have access to an allowed driver. They only have access to the game's poor default SSAO. But I'm thinking maybe people need a refresher on how this hurts the NVIDIA owners. Let's say they want to upgrade their hardware to play new generation games at a console level, and say that the Nvidia competitors are offering an objectively better product. Well, that Nvidia owner will be punished for not staying with Nvidia because that vendor won't have compatible driver-based ambient occlusion for that consumer's existing catalog. Their hardware purchase is now being swayed because essentially a software vendor pimped their product to a hardware vendor. Had Kojima Productions implemented HBO competently, such as the in-engine based version seen in Need for Speed 2015, all consumers would have access to quality graphics, and Nvidia owners would have the ability to solely base their hardware purchase decisions on vendor competence. It's deranged enough that ambient occlusion would be weaponized like this, and similar scenarios exist with other games and other graphic features. It's nothing less than psychotic when the basic image quality of our games, or as developers, our engine choices, are purposely degrading in quality because distributors expect their customer to depend on their vendors. Alan Wake 2 is a perfect example of this. The image quality of the game is dependent on how much research that vendor put into their upscaling/anti-aliasing. You're at the mercy of hardware vendors when studios should bear that responsibility instead. You might respond with the fact that AI hardware is becoming standard, so why continue to ignore it? Because we've barely tapped into the potential of high-end, non-AI equipped GPUs. And just because a vendor offers exclusive tricks doesn't mean the consumer will benefit if the developer of said game or engine takes advantage of that trick. Crysis 3 is a perfect example of this. NVIDIA's goal with TXAA 2X was to offer players 4x MSAA at the cost of 2x MSAA. To achieve this, subpixel jitter is applied to the player's camera when 2x MSAA is enabled, and the frames are blended using a black box resolve solution, meaning the temporal resolve code is distributed in a similar fashion as today's DLSS, where no developer can modify or fully understand how the code operates. It only works on select GPUs, and it expects predetermined inputs that the rendering pipeline has to accommodate for. And the output quality is solely dictated by the vendor. SMAA 4X also jitters 2x MSAA to achieve a 4x MSAA-like resolve. But because the studio developed the resolve code themselves, they had code that could be improved with continuous research, such as morphological fallback. Because the developers weren't restricted by a black box solution, they were able to surpass TXAA in clarity because TXAA accumulates multiple frames instead of a singular previous frame, causing a blurrier and smeared look. SMAA only requires 3% more GPU utilization than TXAA 2X at 1080p on a desktop 3060, which makes sense considering this was long before compute shader SMAA was developed. We went from vendor-agnostic image quality that would allow you to upgrade to any vendor without consequence to being at the constant mercy of NVIDIA because using common sense we can predict that their competitors will never catch up. Simply look at the current situation and witness how marketing sculpts everything. The reason why vendor-agnostic image quality tends to be poor is because developers and studios marketed a lie. That blurrier, worse-looking TAA was optimizing rendering. That lowered the value of more competent anti-aliasing and competent image quality because complacency was instilled in the consumer. The consumer excused the drop in image quality for so-called better performance. That was the story for years until our videos showed far worse optimization issues existed, and poor anti-aliasing was used as a scapegoat to gaslight consumers into accepting worse performance. Had the real optimization issues been fixed, the rendering pipeline wouldn't have required worse image quality. Then, because of incompetent MSAA implementations such as the ones we analyzed in Crysis 3 were marketed to the public, the demand for MSAA dropped. Think about it. The demand for MSAA was reduced because of an unfaithful representation of the technique. This, in combination with the anti-aliasing getting worse because of fake optimization, people were forced to compensate with computationally unsustainable resolutions such as 4K. 4K with modern and competent anti-aliasing is going to have extremely similar texture and geometric sampling as 1080p with competent anti-aliasing, but with much worse performance. Simply integer scale 2013's Crysis 3 in some of the more lit jungle scenes with working SMAA 4X, which isn't even a fully competent solution, at 1080p on a 4K TV. Then boot up modern Crysis 2 remastered with SMAA 2TX or TAA at native 4K. Compare the performance and visual ratio between the two gaming setups at 60 FPS and judge the results at a reasonable sitting distance. It will be painfully apparent that current consoles and general affordable hardware should target richer visuals at 1080p than the 4K messes that are being marketed to us now, as we're seeing with TSR, Insomniac's Temporal Injector, and the new upscaler that's going to be shipping soon in Nixie's Death Stranding 2 PC port. A lot of people said if competent MSAA was used instead of TAA for the native test, the blind test results wouldn't have favored DLSS so much. That is another false claim that this channel is trying to destroy. A fair test would have included MSAA with filtered bitmaps and modern specular anti-aliasing, cheap techniques Half-Life Alyx pioneered in to keep MSAA visuals shimmer-free. But nobody talks about the techniques used in that game because the mainstream discussion built by tech influencers create hyper-focused attention on vendor upscaling developments. That boosts the market value of upscalers, which motivates organizations to continue its research. Influencers are the reason why large amounts of consumers will criticize studios if they don't update their games with the latest DLL or vendor-produced software, instead of demanding the tech mentioned before because it isn't mainstream enough. How is depending on a studio to consistently update their game upscaler version good for you? How is having to constantly update your game's upscalers because of consumer criticism good for your game studio? How is relying on game studios to update their upscalers good for vendors? So in the end, there is no debate. Graphics are being neglected, and Nvidia will solely reap the benefits until companies focus on developing hardware-agnostic methods that close the quality gap. That's not going to happen until influencers stop dramatizing an image quality race that doesn't exist. I want to bring attention to another example of gullible complacency now that Resident Evil 9 is out. This post was made during the promotional campaign, and people like this were defending sub 60 FPS gameplay at 4K on a 5090. They defend path tracing because it provides movie quality results, except that's a lie. Nvidia has rebranded the term path tracing in the same way they've rebranded performance, so that they could legally lie to you. It's clear as day that the path tracing option is simply a compensatory option for the fact that shadow softening has been completely botched, along with shading models, ambient occlusion, basic GI propagation, and even ray-traced reflections are now suddenly looking worse to further promote the need for path tracing. You do not get movie quality results with path tracing in this game. It's a massively reduced concept of path tracing, which is why it doesn't look like a movie. It's why reflections are so much worse than many ray-traced only games. But these people further downplay the situation by saying just turn it off. This is the same stupid method, the same stupid words and everything that Unreal shills use to downplay poor TAA in Unreal. They simplify a gigantic problem into an imaginary make things better menu option because they refuse to understand an ecosystem of consequences. Sure, people can turn off path tracing. That doesn't fix the fact that the game's visuals are extremely noisy with ray tracing, and the highest end rasterized graphics offered in the game are worse looking than basic 7th gen and 8th gen graphics. Higher quality assets like textures or polycount is not the same thing as higher quality graphics like occlusion tech or shading models. Whether it was paid incompetence or actual incompetence, but because Capcom butchered basic graphics including the visuals on console, consumers are punished for not having extremely high-end GPUs. They are punished for not having the latest RT cores, or not having the hardware for multi-frame gen AI. But the studios and Nvidia get away with this because they spend millions and millions of dollars hyping up anti-consumer garbage to get people at this level of complacency. This is the same trillion-dollar company that will pay the biggest game journalism company to get a fake expert from Digital Foundry to lie to an unsuspecting consumer. That is, unless the woman in the video is an actress. But at minute 824, the so-called expert Alex Battaglia is just reading a script and taking a Nvidia-sponsored game that purposely removes grass from the rasterized shadow path to say how much better ray-traced plant shadows are. He lies to this woman's face when he says the plant shadows are going to move like the actual plant on screen. But you can see it in the video, that the ray trace shadows don't even move with the plant because of a ray tracing limitation I explained in my Alan Wake 2 analysis. A limitation that would be fixed by the pro-consumer tech he is paid to criticize in that video, being shadow maps. But it's that level of lying that Nvidia uses in their advertisements. So let's loop back to square one. Why would the industry fix anti-aliasing when it's rewarded with excuses that claim false performance promises that distract from actual optimization issues? Why would the industry continue MSAA research when it's rejected by consumers over a false representation of the technique? Why would studios invest in basic, competent vendor-agnostic graphics when Nvidia has created an army of brainwashed consumers that refuse to look at what pre-RTX graphics had achieved? Why would non-leading hardware vendors promote vendor-agnostic graphics to lower Nvidia's market value when tech influencers reward their second-rate upscaling developments with constant attention? Yet people have the audacity to criticize my attitude when I'm telling you right now I'm not angry enough. Millions of people should be angry over this, gamers and developers, because that is the only sane reaction when you recognize how many lies and blind actions found the optimization issues we currently deal with. If people were rightfully angry instead of pathetically bummed out, I wouldn't have to substitute mass anger that would lead to inherent action. But because there's a lack of anger, there's a lack of action. But I'll tell you what, there is a reason to fix graphics, because this channel is rebuilding a market that matters. Nvidia has to pay millions in order to slowly eat away at people's basic standards to replace it with utter complacency because it's founded on lies. But when this channel makes a video about tone mapping, optimized shadow map implementations, the importance of BRDFs, people like Markiplier start talking about this tech. This channel didn't need to be backed by $1 trillion company to get people like Markiplier talking about Callisto's BRDF technologies. If you're missing why this is important, let me show you this retweet of someone asking why studios are purposely stating their games are not using nanite or lumen. Because the market value of these technologies are dropping. The entire market value of Unreal Engine took a massive hit when directors finally stepped up from our criticism of incompetent leaders, when they finally parroted the proof that we showed about the engine. We are building market value for pro-consumer, vendor-agnostic, optimized technologies. A future where BRDFs, intelligent pre-passing, competent shadow maps, proper deferred MSA, and all these other standards we defined on this channel are marketed to people because we've explained to them why they're better and why they're more optimized than whatever mess NVIDIA tries to push instead. We're building a future that rewards optimization with marketing. Thank you so much to the people who support this channel, as your contribution is a substitution against years and millions of dollars spent on propagating lies. I do want to leave you with a good thought. We've been able to analyze 14 different rendering pipelines at a fidelity in which important conclusions about optimization can be gained on a public level. We've been able to do that in under only 2 years, while also discussing industry news and issues. But there are so many more pipelines that we need to learn from. So subscribe and join our Patreon to support what's coming next. Thank you for watching this video.